Crushing the cultural Marxists, breaking the grip of corrupt oligarchs, and taking back our country through America first. Here's your host of Liberty and Reality, John Henson.
Welcome back to Liberty and Reality. First thing I want to do is wish everybody a belated Happy Independence Day. I know out here it was absolutely booming. So the tribal fireworks stands must have made a killing this year. Definitely people were into celebrating America's 250th birthday, which I was ecstatic to hear. I myself did not light off any fireworks this year. I went and saw the new George Washington movie, Young Washington. I liked the movie. I walked away feeling good, which a lot of movies don't let you walk away feeling good, especially American historical type movies. Definitely gratuitous use of history. But, it's okay. It was fun. I enjoyed it. And you should go watch it. I think it's great that we're seeing more of these patriotic movies come out again. And no stupid woke messaging. Unfortunately, not even one American was depicted in the whole movie because it was about the French and Indian War. America wasn't a country yet. But great movie. Great story about George Washington and some of the other people that were around at that time. So you kind of get a feeling of what happened, and definitely opens up an avenue if you're interested and curious to go find out more about that period of history, because French and Indian War it's an era that a lot of people don't really know about, including myself. I know what it was. I know what was on the line, but I didn't know a whole lot about it, and I learned a little bit during the movie, so that was pretty cool. So today, before I start about talking about what our actual topic is, I want to get into something I saw this morning on the Dan Bongino podcast that really just continues to bother me. You had a whole segment about this argument, I guess the text argument he's been having with Tucker Carlson. I'm like, man, okay, I understand that you guys have a little tiff between each other. I don't care, and I don't want to hear about it. You guys go work it out. Go debate it. Go do something. It's so stupid. You're two guys who were coworkers over at Fox, if you remember. And they were very close to Trump when he was running in 2024. These are two guys that really took the lead in the America First movement heading into 2024. I remember them walking out at UFC together with Trump, Kid Rock, having a great time, partying it up. And then, they can't get along anymore. They can't get along anymore because obviously Trump changed his policies. We all know it. Pissed Tucker Carlson off, pissed a lot of people off. Totally get it. But you guys are just advocating against yourself. Tucker said he's leaving the Republican Party. Okay, great. And do what? We don't know what you're going to do. I guess that's your business. You're an individual, independent citizen. But dude, what's going on? What's going on? You guys are just destroying the movement from within. We know that the Marxists, not the cultural Marxists, but just straight up Marxists, people that want to be communists, want to make the country communist, are getting elected in these Democratic Party primaries. I've already seen it. I've already talked about it. So you guys need to put the pistols away or go have a duel. I don't care. Go settle it. Stop talking about it in public because nobody cares about your tiff. Just talk about what's important, how we keep our Western civilization and how we keep Marxism from taking over, because it's going to destroy the country. And these kids that are being tricked in our American education system to vote for this stuff, they're just advocating against their own, they're against themselves, against their own future. And really, if you look at the people that suffer most, the poor, they're really going to get hurt. They're really going to get hurt. There's only so many productive people. There's only so many productive dollars. And once that's gone, we know what happens. Every Marxist regime does the same thing. You just turn on the working class. So that's where you're headed if you keep going. And Tucker, Dan, that's where you're taking us. You and all the other people out there bickering and whining. Okay? I get Trump is doing things that piss us all off. And now the war's back on, I guess. And Trump has been trying to fix that mistake he made. And he just can't get out of it. It's a quagmire. Anybody who knows anything about CENTCOM and the operational challenges of Iran, anybody who's been anywhere near that, war games or whatever, could predict this was going to happen. So now we're in this we have this problem, and we talked about this being a civilizational clash. So the Iranians aren't going to give up. We're probably not going to give up, even if it hurts us. So I don't know what's going to happen, but I guess we'll see. We're all here for the ride because it's just the way it is. We're not going to walk away, and they're not going to walk away. So we'll see what happens. Hopefully, I hope for the best. That's all I can say. But you guys, quit bickering. Quit bickering. Work it out. The other one I saw was Candace Owens on the Sean Ryan podcast. Now, this has nothing to do with Candace Owens or the things she's been saying on her show. I'm not going to talk about that. I know she's been controversial. I'm going to talk about this. She talked about when she left the Daily Wire, being lucky that she brought over her producer and her director and her writers and all these people. I'm like, dude, I'm so freaking jealous of you. I'm doing all of it here by myself. Just a little old me. Just John. Yeah. Well, good for you. Good for you, Candace. All you got to do is talk. You do a good job of it. My hat's off to you. And you've earned it. You've earned it. You've had a long road, so that's cool. But I just want to point that out. I don't know why. Today, that's not what we're talking about today. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about the history of America's economy. More specifically, how the government and the elites have worked together to the detriment of the working class. Now, you're going to see a change as we go along because the original kings of industry, as they were called through the 1880s and through the 1800s and the 1900s, at least early on, they were into production, building things, making things. A lot of the problem between government and those elites came with the railroads expanding west. And they just overstretched themselves because guess what? The free market is the best way to make decisions. And they were making government decisions at that time, bad decisions with our money. So the results are always pretty easy to guess. And unfortunately, as I pointed out, we're in kind of one of those cycles now, but it's different because there's a psychological element to it. There's a global, I don't want to call it globalist element. It is a globalist element, but there is a cabal at the top that's not just American, the global cabal. People from outside being brought in to tamper with our politics, to control Americans. Different models being brought in from the outside, tearing down Western civilization. So we're going to talk about what's happened in the past, and we're going to focus specifically on more recent history and how that's gone down and where we're headed. So, when the country was founded, like I said, there were a lot of times where we had economic collapses. There was the Panic of 1873 and 1893. Those both caused depressions. And as a matter of fact, they were called the Great Depression, before the actual Great Depression in the 1930s. And into the 20th century, from about 1877 on, there were a lot of industrial strikes related to this. And Marxists came in, like Eugene Debs, and called for capitalism's overthrow. So those ideas were around back since the 1800s, but they never really caught steam. I mean, there were some unions that were founded based on that, but the Marxists never got a foothold into the culture, at least not back then. Now, some of the major banks merged with family companies into corporations along the way, especially in the 1900s, as these kings of industry died. They became corporate. They were run by, instead of a person that had some pride in the company, because those guys, one thing they did is have pride in their companies. They're run by executive boards and focused strictly on their quarterly earnings. And we go back to World War I and the effects of World War I, those consequences that really led up to the Great Depression. The American banks, after World War I, they funded Germany so Germany could pay off its war debt to European countries, particularly France and the UK. And on the other side, France and the UK were borrowing money from us as well to rebuild their own countries. And what happened was U.S. banks got overstretched. They figured out that they were having problems, and they were chasing higher profits at home. So they stopped loaning to the Germans. And at that point, the European credit disappeared. The global trade halted at that point. And there were also tariff issues at that time. The United States had passed some tariffs that also halted and slowed global trade. So that led to the stock market crash and the global depression. The Fed had cut interest rates in 1927. That created a stock bubble that collapsed into the Great Depression in 1929, starting in 1929. And it lasted for, 2 decades, up until World War II. And the economy never got back on track truly until Eisenhower was the president in the 50s, because Eisenhower decided to be responsible, and he undertook austerity measures. He reined in deficit spending, and he allowed private production to expand. So that stabilized the economy. We talked about how patriotic American working class was in the 50s. And they were anti-Marxist. They were ardently anti-Marxist. We were in the Cold War. We had fought in Korea against the Chinese. We understood the threat of nuclear annihilation. People were just becoming aware of that because our enemies were developing and testing nuclear weapons. And so there was a fear that there would be communists that took over the world. So the country was united. The working class was united. And the working class was doing pretty well in the 50s, despite some recessions at the beginning when Eisenhower first started austerity measures. And then when Kennedy took over, the deficit spending started to tick up a bit. Kennedy funded the space race. He wanted to get to the moon. Wanted to get to the moon before the Russians, and as well as the Cold War buildup, because the Cold War was really ramping up at that point. And of course, that's where we started to get into Vietnam. We were sending teams of advisors, quote unquote advisors, over there. So we were slowly ramping up in Vietnam. But, Kennedy wasn't terrible about the fiscal discipline. He started spending a bit more, but it wasn't terrible until LBJ took office. And we've talked about this before, but, LBJ launched his massive domestic spending program for the Great Society, as well as ramping up in Vietnam. He did not want to lose Vietnam. He was terrified of it. Of course, that's what ended up, the economic problems that began along with his challenges in Vietnam, the Tet Offensive especially, because that was looked at it as a loss, even though it shouldn't have been. It was American press that said that. But in any case, it was his fault that we ramped up and got so deep into Vietnam, and that was his undoing as president. That's what caused him to decide not to run. But even when LBJ was in office, the gold, the dollar was tied to gold under the Bretton Woods system. So this was supposed to prevent the government from printing paper money, just irresponsibly, because there's going to be economic inflationary consequences on the public. People would know. People would understand. They'd feel it. So, of course, to pay the bills, pay all this money, pay for all this debt that Johnson was racking up, he did start printing those dollars irresponsibly. And that caused some of the European countries like France to come to the United States and say, hey, you know what? We're just going to take our gold out of your vaults. We want it back because we don't trust this dollar. You guys are being irresponsible. And they started to drain the U.S. vaults, caused a big problem in the United States for our economy. So Nixon stopped that in 1971. He stopped countries from drawing gold, and he ended the gold standard. And this was the biggest sin he could have committed for the American people. He officially decoupled the dollar from gold. This is where the fiat currency problem started. And even progressive economists like John Maynard Keynes argued that deficit spending should only be used as a temporary tool during recessions. There was the only ones that ever saw us spending this much money and getting into this much debt would have been the Marxists. Now, Keynes, he felt that the government should spend money to get the economy out of downturns when there was a problem, a recession, a depression. But he also felt on the other side, when the economy was good, we needed to build surpluses, and we didn't do that. That was the problem. So only the Marxists, out of all the economic ideas, only the Marxists would advocate for us running this giant debt. So, as I said, we're kind of in a Marxist system already. We're not really in a free market. Now, obviously, the unbacked currency system, it kind of tamed the domestic inflation, but there was still inflation. And you saw it up until Jimmy Carter. There were some other things going on globally that caused the gas spikes. But the economy was kind of in the doldrums through the 70s. And because we were off the gold standard, that was the driving force behind companies outsourcing manufacturing overseas, particularly to places like Japan. And there was a lot of fear in the 70s and the 80s that Japan was going to overtake the U.S. economy. There was even fears of a renewed Japanese militarism to go along with their economic performance, their economic takeover. So that's where our companies, our industrial base, began to be shipped overseas. And we talked about how Nixon opening China really got some American industrialists. It gave them a way to make even more money. They got really excited because they could go ship our jobs over to China. They knew that. Massive labor market. One of the reasons they wanted to do it so bad. So investors, after we decoupled from gold, they abandoned cash, just like the other countries of the world, and shifted their focus toward acquiring assets to increase their wealth. And by the 80s, you saw this evolve into things like corporate raiding, where one big company would buy up smaller companies, and they would strip it off, or they would sell it, or they would just put it in their conglomerate. And they did this rather than investing in new production or new infrastructure. They just buy up companies, smaller companies. So really the expansion of our productive capacity stopped as a result of this. By the 90s, federal laws were completely changed to allow ordinary banks to merge with Wall Street investment firms. And this created these massive financial institutions, these too big to fail institutions. And these institutions, they just focused on trading assets and packaging consumer debt for profit. They were all about making money, and none of it was about production. It was about feeding off of failure, making money off of failure. That's what they did. They promoted failure. American businesses fell in love with this conglomeration, at least the powerful ones. So companies stopped trying to perfect one great product and instead started buying up completely unrelated businesses. And it was just to boost their stock prices. As corporate growth also gave these people at the top of these companies a legal shield. They could hide behind layers of smaller companies so they couldn't be sued directly. And it also made it almost impossible for the government to break them up. They basically became monopolies, a lot of them. And so you remember that legal shield. I mean, I guess we talked about this as well, changing the legal system. But that really wouldn't matter for these companies because they just hid behind their lower bosses. It's like a mafia, basically. Protect the guy at the top at all costs. I don't think the smaller guys that may have been victims of this wanted that, but that's what happened. And part of this corporate shift also took over Hollywood. Some of these corporations took over these legacy independent Hollywood studios that were once run by passionate creative showmen. And now they were just swallowed up by faceless corporate entities that eventually changed the way they did their own programming based on what those corporate entities wanted. We'll get into that in a little bit. And, for example, there's companies like Kinney National Company that bought out Warner Brothers, or Gulf and Western bought out Paramount. Those were a bit earlier on, but this evolution started early. But by the 1990s and 2000s, this evolved into a transnational, globalized system where true ownership of the economy moved away from actual managers and into the hands of mega asset managers. I should say the actual government, the actual free market system into the hands of these mega asset managers. And firms like BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street ran the economy. They ran the assets. They were the big money, big wealth holders in the economy, not the producers, not people making things, not people actually making jobs, producing jobs, helping the American working class. It was all about making themselves rich, making people rich. And of course, they did bring the American working class into the fold through things like retirement funds. But they never brought them in very close to the fold. They were doing it for themselves, not for the working class, after all. And Americans slowly realized this new system was hostile to their interests. And really the first public display that I remember, maybe there's something earlier, if anybody else knows that. The first public display I remember was here close to where I was, because I was going to school at University of Washington when the World Trade Organization protest took place in Seattle, also known as the Battle in Seattle. And it wasn't about identity politics, although a lot of these groups that came up to protest were the predecessors to Antifa. They were known as anarchists. I remember the news calling them anarchists. I also remember the cops lining up from one side of the street to the other with riot shields. They had tear gas, rubber bullets, and they drove these people out in a few hours. It didn't take long. Not like with the globalist-driven Black Lives Matter protests, where they just went on for weeks and weeks. That time the globalists weren't bullshitting around with it. They were going to shut it down, and they did pretty quick. And some of the things that those protests were angry about were China getting most favored nation status because they knew their jobs were going to be gone. They knew it was taking away their future. They could see what this oligarch class was doing early on. They could see they're being sold out to countries that not only had cheap labor, but they didn't have any labor standards. They didn't have regulations. You know, at least those people were smart enough to see the future. Unfortunately, at some point, they were subverted, and now they're running shoulder to shoulder with the Marxists. It's really sad to see. So while the mainstream labor unions at that time tried to be, they weren't really part of it. It was radicals. It was the radicals. Um, so that was the people that were rising up, a radical movement, a radical, um, just sudden movement, an organic movement rose up against this oligarch corruption. So, as the 90s went on, globalism really took hold. And I remember when I was going to college, I was an international relations major at UW, and all they could talk about was how great globalism would be, a globalized economy. They made it sound good. And really, in terms of economic theory, it is good. It sounds great, but it's not supposed to sell out the American people like it did. They didn't talk about the asset holders. They were talking about how efficient it would be for production. And it was very efficient when you can ship your production jobs to places with low cost labor and no regulation. It's great. Not for us, though, not for American working class. So overall, globalism has been a net negative. The 2008 financial crisis hit because once again, the asset holders, the banks, overstretched themselves and a debt bubble was created. The primary thing in 2008 was a real estate bubble. And of course, we know that instead of the government bailing out the actual homeowners, they decided to bail out the banks. So a lot of people took their investment, threw the keys on the counter. They probably shouldn't have been in those houses anyway, but government regulation made decisions where they could be, and they lost their homes. They lost their dream. They walked away. The banks took over those assets, being bailed out by the government for the money they were losing at that time. Of course, that wasn't going to last forever. I'm pretty sure they knew that. Just hang out for a while, you're going to get your money back and more, a lot more. That's what happened. That's why the price of real estate has almost doubled since then, a lot of places. Now, as a reaction to that 2008 financial crisis, the Tea Party movement was born. And it was originally launched by Ron Paul, and he and his supporters advocated for ending the Federal Reserve in order to get rid of this inflation, in order to stop these boom bust cycles in the economy, in order to take our economy back. He wanted us to get back on the gold standard. Ron Paul knew. His followers knew. But, of course, the globalist oligarchs, they couldn't let that happen. And it, they really panicked. They hijacked the Tea Party movement by flooding it with millions of dollars through billionaire-funded groups like Freedom Works and Americans for Prosperity, which were really just cover for the oligarch class. They were cover to change the message from ending the Fed. And, they established professional chapters. They took over rally stages. They went out and talked about how they were right there with the American working class. Well, they just drowned out the original grassroots movement, and people walked away and became a mainstream Republican movement. And, you had people like Ted Cruz and Nikki Haley, corporate deep state Republicans that were out there helping to end the Tea Party movement while saying they were part of it, saying they supported it. They just wanted to support their donors. And so it died, unfortunately. Ron Paul ran for president a couple times, but he couldn't get the traction. Who was going to support him? He's taking money away from the deep state. That can't happen. The deep state and their media cronies, by the way. So later on, 2011, there was another populist movement, the Occupy movement. This was a more progressive movement. And it was more of a Marxist movement. But the same young people, they were targeting the 1%. They said the 1% was working against the 99%. I don't think they understood what the 1% was. But it sounded good. They went out and they protested. They protested on Wall Street, Occupy Wall Street, camped out for days and days. So did it have an effect? No, it ended up collapsing. Nothing happened. So it was just the working class rage trying to get control of something they didn't understand. They knew something was going on, but didn't know how to fix it. They didn't know how to fix the problem. And their movement died, especially on the left. And let me be more specific. There's a reason it died, because between the Tea Party movement and Occupy Wall Street, the oligarch class realized they needed to do something, because these organic working class movements weren't going to stop. Eventually, there's going to be one that they couldn't control. We were going to have an American color revolution, and they knew it was coming. We were getting close to that. People were mad. So, of course, they owned the media giants. They owned the messaging. And this partisan is really important, because this is how we got to this crazy state of affairs where Marxism has taken over our institutions. Of course, this had been a plan for a long time. The seeds were planted long ago in academics. But this is where the oligarchs put their money behind it. They pulled the Marxist critical theory and the divisive identity politics frameworks straight out of those Marxist, those old Marcusa ideas out of the 60s. Same stuff that was talked about then, and started to disseminate it through the media, through the colleges, through all the institutions. And during the Obama administration, remember Obama, when he first was running, when he first got into office, he ran on a platform of change that included things like border protection. He was not for open borders. He was against gay marriage. He was for a lot of traditional policies. He wasn't advocating any of this cultural Marxism when he was running for president. But he completely changed his position a few years in. I can't explain what happened. I wasn't in the room. I don't know why it happened. All I can say is Obama made a lot of money when he left office. Now he lives in Martha's Vineyard, the most elite area in the country. It's just amazing that he could do that on a government salary, right? Sure. And so during the Obama administration, that ideology, the cultural Marxism, really emerged into public view. And it made enemies based on race, gender, and identity groups. Between 2011 and 2016, major media and entertainment outlets saw a spike in grievance-based oppressor versus oppressed narratives in movies, television, stories, comic books, video games, everything. Every media, every way they could disseminate through the media, anything electronic, social media, it all came into play. And you wonder why Trump got elected the first time. That was it. It was another reaction to this. It didn't end it. Really made it speed up. In the corporate machine, they scrubbed stories about regular people fighting Wall Street greed. They couldn't have that. Um, they couldn't have that out there. They replaced it with endless digital culture wars that kept people distracted. They fixated on forced ideological messaging and triggered, within the entertainment industry, you saw it, so many movies, through in the music, everything. They turned beloved franchises into major box office disasters because the studios, it really wasn't the studios, the people running the studios cared more about ideology than quality of their movies. They just wanted to send a message. And even the Academy Awards changed, where they had to have, you know, so many homosexual movements in their movies, so many racial movements. They just went woke. They went woke, and people hated it. The movies coming out of Hollywood just got so bad because they had to meet the Academy Awards criteria. That's where a lot of it came from, but not all of it. Not all of it. You saw the movie stars that you'd seen in racy movies since the 80s, 70s, whenever, and they suddenly rejected all those things that they used to talk about, all those comedies they used to be in, and why I could never do that. I don't know why I did that. Was such a mistake. No, bullshit. Just being paid off to say that. You're being paid off to become a cultural Marxist now. That's what they did. Wokeism, um, it became the new elitist thing. Um, so, and we saw this, like I said, in several movies. Lucasfilm, Star Wars. Oh my God, they destroyed Star Wars, especially with the last three movies. They subverted, heroes like Luke Skywalker, just made him weak, made him the depressed, weak hermit. Um, he was not a hero in that movie. And people reacted against it. They didn't like those movies. Snow White, the live action remake of Snow White, was just a complete failure. It abandoned the core story. They replaced the Seven Dwarfs with politically correct people. They weren't dwarves anymore. Couldn't have dwarves. They erased the traditional love story. They, instead of having Snow White, the white actress, it's called Snow White, they casted a Latina actress. I don't care. I don't mind them casting a Latina actress, but the story is called Snow White. So it's just weird. It doesn't match. And the worst thing though was the actress actually trashed the original script, the original movie, because she had to have girl power. It was just horrible. But Lightyear was worse. Lightyear injected adult themes. It was it's a family movie, the cartoon. They had to have an on-screen same-sex kiss between two lesbians. And the two female characters they didn't say they were married, but obviously they were in some sort of relationship where they were going to have a son together with a sperm donor. It's great. Well, there's no need for that stuff in kids' movies, but that's what they were doing because they wanted to push the Marxism, the cultural Marxism. They want to push Pride, which is the cultural Marxist movement. They want to diminish the nuclear family. Can't have that. Because that's the core of Western civilization, you see. They can't allow Western civilization to survive. They got to destroy that. That's what Marxism, particularly critical theory, is all about. Destroy Western civilization. So this new Marxism can emerge. And of course, parents were pissed. They didn't take their kids to see Lightyear. A lot of them walked out of the theater. They were done. And I think there was a new one that came out more recently. I don't know how it did, but I imagine it didn't do well. I think people lost trust. A lot of people lost trust in Disney during that period, especially with their kids' movies. And also, things like Nickelodeon did the same thing. Nickelodeon had Black Lives Matter. They had Pride. They had all this crazy stuff. Nickelodeon's a kids' channel. It was just unnecessary. It's all cultural Marxist political nonsense. But they got to get the kids. Got to get them. Excuse me. Got to get them early. Pardon me with that. You got to get them early. So that's what they did. Pixar, more recently, the movie Elio. Um, and it's Elio basically lives in a communist world. That's what the movie's about. Um, and it targets, of course, it has to target ICE, has to target immigration policies in a roundabout way. Oh, they're all always in a roundabout way, but the messaging is clear. So, Elio's world is not based on individual merit. It's just based on equity, on just whatever crazy ideas they want to put in there, unrealistic. So, Hollywood has just become this toxic, preachy, woke hub, and it's dying because of it. You see a lot more foreign movies. You see a lot more foreign actors in American cinema. Hollywood is dying. A lot of movies have moved to places like Georgia. They moved to Canada. They moved out of Hollywood. Shoot days in Hollywood have plummeted from over 36,000 to below 19,000 now. Over 41,000 entertainment workers have left Los Angeles. Major studios, like I said, they're moving out of California. And also, that opens for countries like China to push their propaganda into the country. Because Americans are making worse movies and fewer movies. We'll see that in a minute. I'll go through that. But this entire shift is just a clear pattern of Marxist cultural self-sabotage that's being pushed by the elite and pushing division. So we don't see what they're doing because they almost lost it with the Occupy movement and the Tea Party movement. We almost got it together against them. And of course, when Trump was elected, that really, really threatened them in 2016. They everybody expected Hillary Clinton was going to get elected. When that didn't happen, of course, Trump's an oligarch. He's got a lot of money. He's been in the real estate business, but he is creating things. He's building buildings. He's not just buying real estate, he's building things. So he wasn't their kind of oligarch. He wasn't one of the globalist oligarchs. He's just a guy who made a lot of money in the American system. And for a lot of our modern history anyway, Trump has been kind of the icon of being the rich guy, being the rich guy in America, being someone to aspire to until he was elected president, of course. You can go back and see him. He was a regular on shows like Larry King or Oprah. Him and Oprah were friends. Matter of fact, Oprah talked about running as his vice president at one point, back when he was not a Republican. So, it's amazing how things change. It's amazing how Trump changed as well. But when we talk about opening the door for Chinese influence, look at Doctor Strange, the movie in 2016. Now, I used to read Doctor Strange, the comic, when I was a teenager, and the ancient one was a Tibetan monk. They had to change that because that insulted China, and they made the ancient one into a Irish white woman with bald hair, with a bald head, which is really weird. But that's the direction they went. And of course, one of the people guarding the temple had to be Chinese as well, by a famous Chinese actor. So yeah, a lot of messaging there. So they could market the movie in China. They can make money there. 2012 Red Dawn, the Red Dawn remake, which I really didn't like. It was okay, I guess, but they had completely finished that film. I don't know how long they had been filming that, but originally it was the Chinese who were taking over America, which was a lot more realistic. And they had to go back and completely scrub that, and it had to be the North Koreans, which is completely unrealistic. Of course, the first one, it was the Russians invading, and the Cubans were one of the one of the groups that was there, they were fighting, that um, the kids in Red Dawn were fighting. So when it's just the North Koreans, completely unrealistic. They just did it to please the Chinese censors. China couldn't look bad. The new Top Gun Maverick, which is supposed to be a patriotic movie, when they originally released the trailer for the movie, Maverick's jacket, it didn't have the Taiwan flag or the Japan flag because they had to please, once again, the Chinese censors. And the Chinese were helping fund that movie. The company Tencent from China was hoping to fund that movie. And there was a big backlash because, of course, a lot of patriots, they loved that movie. They wanted to see the new one, and they realized what was going on. So Paramount was pressured to put the flags back on Maverick's jacket, and that caused the CCP to pull 10-cent support. It forced them to stop backing the movie, and they backed out. But that's good because at least it shows that when we push back, we can win. We don't have to push that back that hard. That was just a movie. We won. We won. We beat them. So we can do that if we stay together. Now, the movie Abominable was another one. I haven't seen this movie, so I'm not sure where this came into play, but I was just reading about this. China has this thing they call the 9-dash line, and it comes from an old map that they dug out from somewhere that shows that they own the entire South China Sea. That there's a old map that shows a line across the whole China Sea indicating that it's Chinese. So they use that as justification to take sovereignty over that, or they're trying to. They can't enforce it with the United States, but they're saying they're sovereign over that area. And long term, that's what they want to do, is just take over. And if they can get strong enough, get their navy strong enough, build up the little islands out there, not much of anything but rocks sticking out of the ground, but they're building them. They're bringing in tons of concrete, and they're building little bases out there. And once they get strong enough, they're going to try to block that. Maybe make Americans, try to force Americans to pay a toll to go through it, or other countries to pay a toll to go through there. Ask China's permission. That's what they want. And they're slowly getting there. Think about the model that Iran is trying to put into place in the Straits of Hormuz. Make countries and ships pay a toll to go through. Wait till China starts doing that. 70% of our commerce goes through the South China Sea. So it's going to have a big impact on the United States. But this movie Abominable put this in. It's not an internationally recognized boundary. Well, it's only the Chinese saying they own this. And other countries, Vietnam, Malaysia, the Philippines, they're in active conflict, and sometimes hot conflict. Sometimes there's shots fired. Sometimes there's ships banging into each other, or invasion forces on some of these little rocks and stuff. So this is a big deal to these other countries, and it was a backlash in their countries to see this. They banned the movie in their countries. But that's another example of American movie companies bowing to the Chinese censors. Now, American companies, our studios, our places that show movies, theaters or streaming services, they don't put up these barriers to China. They allow the propaganda in. And the biggest example of this was Wolf Warrior 2. And Wolf Warrior 2 made the American soldiers, into villainous, bloodthirsty terrorists. We were the bad guys. And the heroes were the Chinese forces who wiped us out. And it literally created this thing called Wolf Warrior diplomacy, where the Chinese go around to different countries and use their entertainment industry to spread propaganda, to change minds. We did it during the Cold War. We were really good at it. Chinese are kind of following our lead, but we're allowing it. They're not. So they're brainwashing American audiences, and we're allowing it to happen. And they're doing it as our leaders use their system to make us be at our own throats over stupid cultural grievances, not even cultural grievances, racial grievances, whatever they want to, whatever group they want to make, gender, sexuality, whatever the thing is this week, so they can control us. So the U.S. economy continues to keep the cosmetic appearance of private property, but really it's just morphed into this centralized command economy with the Federal Reserve at the top, the Federal Reserve and the Treasury making the decisions, but mostly the Federal Reserve. They control the interest rates. And so through the aggressive fiat policy, they are injecting trillions of dollars of fake liquidity into the system. And they dictate the economic outcomes, or they try to. They really can't. They don't have that kind of knowledge. Really, they're just trying to keep it straight. They're trying to keep the economy from collapsing. And we inch closer and closer and closer that direction with every deficit dollar spent. Every step debt goes up. We're inching closer to insolvency. Keep in mind that the interest we pay on the debt is more than the entire military budget. It's astronomical and going up. It's crowding out the rest of the economy. So that's where we're headed. And the working class is going to continue to get crushed under this brutal inflation. We're going to continue relying more and more on social welfare and tax the rich tactics that don't really work. Because the oligarchs know it doesn't matter if you tax them, the money's just going to flow up. They understand how to get around the system. They're just going to continue to ideologically subvert us, just like Bezmenov said that we would be subverted, that the Russians would. I think the Chinese took over, and then the oligarchs just walked hand in hand with them. So, that's where that's where we're headed if we don't change things. We don't stick together. I don't know who has the charisma to be the next Donald Trump, because Donald Trump has kind of turned away from this movement. Charlie Kirk died, and I think that may have been part of it, because I think Charlie Kirk was kind of a middleman. He was a trusted advisor, a trusted mouthpiece by a lot of people on the right, a lot of these talking heads. When he was gone, they just started fighting with each other. He was a uniter. We don't have a uniter now. Somebody needs to step up. Somebody needs to be mature. Stop the fighting. It took a lot of frustration to get people in the streets in Seattle in 99, in the Tea Party movement in 07, and the Occupy movement. America First was the latest. It was the latest movement. It was the latest color revolution against the oligarchs. And it's still here. We just got to keep it together. We worked hard to get this. If we can just keep moving forward, we will take control back from the oligarchs. We'll give it back to the American working class where it belongs. We got to stick together. We got to fight. And thank you for watching. I appreciate you being here and continuing to support the show. Take care.